When critics mocked Karoline Leavitt as nothing more than political bravado, they never expected her to dismantle an entire legal argument in a single afternoon. They said the courthouse in downtown Los Angeles would be swarming with reporters eager to catch a glimpse of the moment Karoline stepped into the legal arena. The case involved a defamation suit that had garnered significant media attention. A corporate tycoon accusing a grassroots activist group of spreading falsehoods that cost him millions. Most people didn't even realize Karoline had any interest in law, assuming she'd just deliver a speech for publicity. The judge assigned was Ronald Beckett, a man notorious for cutting through theatrics with a razor-sharp glare and a heavy gavel. His courtroom was no place for games. Attorneys dreaded being in front of him unless their arguments were airtight. Karoline knew all of that. She read the articles, overheard the snide comments, and felt the weight of expectations. Yet here she was, stepping into the grand marble-floored courtroom where the air hung thick with tension. At a glance, she might have looked a bit too polished. Her tailored navy suit fit perfectly, her hair meticulously styled. She walked past the gallery without so much as a single fidget, ignoring the flashes of cameras from local newspapers and the curious stares of well-seasoned lawyers. Onlookers murmured, some leaning into each other with hushed amusement. "This'll be quick," someone whispered. Another snickered. "She'll get chewed up." Yet none of that derision seemed to register in Karoline's steady gaze. The opposing counsel was already waiting, a seasoned attorney named Bryce Hutcherson, known for his aggressive tactics and flair for showmanship. Hutcherson towered by the plaintiff's table, flipping through a series of thick binders stuffed with carefully tabbed case law. He barely spared Karoline a glance, but his smirk indicated he already saw her as an easy target. Karoline set her documents on the defense table and took her seat. Her co-counsel, an older attorney named Regina Davis, leaned close and whispered, "Remember, speak calmly. Don't let him bait you." Karoline nodded, although she didn't look worried in the least. Judge Beckett emerged from his chambers precisely at 9. Even his entrance was intimidating. Black robes sweeping the floor, eyes already set in a discerning glare. The entire courtroom rose, murmurs ceasing instantly. The bailiff announced the case, and once everyone sat down, Beckett scrutinized the room like he was taking inventory of each person's weaknesses. He cleared his throat. "We're here to address preliminary motions, correct?" he asked, shooting a glance at Hutcherson. Then his gaze cut to Karoline. His eyes narrowed slightly, reflecting mild surprise. "Miss Leavitt," he said, voice echoing through the silent chamber. "This is highly unusual. How old are you?" A ripple of laughter threatened to bubble up from the crowd, but one stern glance from the bailiff silenced it. Karoline rose smoothly. "I'm 25, Your Honor," she replied. She didn't waver. She didn't look embarrassed. She simply projected the calm assurance of someone with a decade more experience. 25, Beckett repeated, tapping a pencil against his desk. "I've had attorneys in their 50s struggle to hold ground in my courtroom. I trust you have a solid reason to be here." "Absolutely, Your Honor," Karoline said. "I'm here to defend a group that's been wrongly accused, and I'm ready to argue the motion." Hutcherson stood, clearly trying to maintain an air of confidence. He gave a dismissive wave. "Your Honor, with all respect, Miss Leavitt has no standing. She's not just young, she's not even a recognized figure in legal circles. I'd like to move that she—" Karoline didn't let him finish. "Your Honor," she cut in, her tone respectful yet firm, "age or reputation doesn't limit a lawyer's ability to interpret the law. If opposing counsel wants to question my credentials, I have them right here." She held up her bar certification calmly. Judge Beckett leaned forward. "Enough," he said, his voice carrying unmistakable finality. He glanced at Hutcherson, then Karoline. "I'll allow you both to present your arguments, but let's keep theatrics to a minimum." The bailiff handed a packet of documents to Beckett, who flipped through them quickly. Hutcherson stepped to the podium first, a crocodile smile plastered on his face. "Your Honor, the plaintiffs allege that Miss Leavitt's clients circulated malicious rumors against my client, who's lost considerable revenue as a result. We believe Miss Leavitt's clients engaged in a reckless smear campaign, ignoring factual data." He gestured grandly toward Karoline. "We also question whether Miss Leavitt truly understands the gravity of these allegations. This is no place for some novice to experiment with the law. The plaintiff's stance remains firm. Her clients published false claims, and we demand a retraction and damages." Karoline remained seated, her expression unmoved by Hutcherson's barbs. When it was her turn, she rose gracefully and approached the podium. "Your Honor, My clients are environmental activists who uncovered legitimate concerns about the plaintiff's factories. They shared their findings, believing in transparency and public welfare. The plaintiff calls it slander. We call it whistleblowing, and the evidence will show that. She slid a neat folder across the table to the bailiff, who passed it to Beckett. In that folder, Your Honor, you'll find a chain of internal emails from the plaintiff's company, acknowledging faulty inspections and potential environmental hazards. The press release my clients put out was based on these documents, which they received from an anonymous tip. A soft murmur rippled through the gallery. Hutcherson's smirk hardened. Judge Beckett arched an eyebrow. And how did they obtain these emails, Miss Leavitt? They were provided by a whistleblower inside the corporation. The whistleblower remains anonymous, but the authenticity of these emails has been verified. Karoline's voice held steady. That's the crux of our defense. Truth. You can't claim defamation if what's being said is demonstrably true. Hutcherson cleared his throat. So you say. But hearsay and stolen documents don't constitute unimpeachable evidence, Your Honor. We'll file a motion to exclude them based on how they were obtained. Karoline's posture remained impeccable. Your Honor, we're also prepared to argue that these documents qualify under the whistleblower protection statutes. The public's right to know outweighs any claim of stolen property, especially given the immediate health risks these emails confirm. Judge Beckett steepled his fingers. His stare bounced between them. Sounds like we have more than enough to fill today's hearing. Miss Leavitt, you're sure you want to go head-to-head with Mr. Hutcherson on these motions? Karoline met his gaze without flinching. I am, Your Honor. The judge gave a curt nod. Then proceed. Hutcherson took the floor, pacing with exaggerated bravado. First, I'd like to address the evidence. Even if these emails are genuine, they were obtained without proper authorization. Therefore, any argument built upon them is moot. We have a legal standard that evidence acquired through questionable means is inadmissible. He paused, letting his words resonate. Second, Miss Leavitt's clients unleashed a media campaign that labeled my client's factory practices poisonous. This is a malicious narrative crafted solely to ruin my client's reputation. He shot Karoline a predatory grin. They had no scientific basis for these claims, just rumor and hype. That's why we're here, for accountability. Karoline waited until he finished. Then she approached the podium, flipping open a binder. Your Honor, she began, we have direct quotes from environmental scientists who evaluated the factory's emissions. These quotes are not rumor. The experts confirmed hazardous levels of pollutants. We've included chemical analysis results. It's all in the packet. Hutcherson interjected. Those so-called experts were commissioned by activist groups. Hardly unbiased, wouldn't you agree? Karoline didn't blink. Expert testimony doesn't lose credibility just because activists fund it, especially when the data is supported by independent labs. But let's be clear, Your Honor, our central argument is simpler. The plaintiff is claiming defamation, yet the statements are backed by verifiable facts. Beckett drummed his fingers on the bench. Hutcherson, do you have conflicting data to challenge these findings? Hutcherson's lips thinned. We do, but it'll come out in full trial. Today we're focusing on the preliminary injunction and the admissibility of those emails. Karoline angled her gaze at him. So, you're asking the court to suppress any mention of the internal communications that reveal potential wrongdoing? She looked at the judge. He wants to bury the very documents that show the truth. Meanwhile, he claims we're the ones who are malicious. All we did was shine a light on something the public should be aware of. A ripple of conversation flickered through the spectators. The tension in the room was palpable, each side quietly assessing who had the upper hand. Judge Beckett raised his gavel for silence, and the murmurs died instantly. Let's address the legitimacy of these emails, Beckett said. Miss Leavitt, you assert whistleblower protection. Mr. Hutcherson, you claim they're obtained illegally. We need clarity. Karoline flipped to a tab in her binder. Under the California Whistleblower Protection Act, if an individual within the organization believes there's a genuine threat to public health, they can release internal data to relevant parties. Here, the relevant parties were environmental watchdog groups. My clients simply shared that data further with the public. She turned to Hutcherson. So the question is, does this hamper the plaintiff's right to privacy, or does the public interest in safe environmental practices override it? Hutcherson brushed imaginary dust from his lapel. We argue no real threat existed. The claims were amplified, exaggerated. Even if the factory had minor infractions, the press releases used the term toxic meltdown hazard, which is hyperbole. Karoline returned to her seat, exhaling calmly. Regina, her co-counsel, whispered encouragement. Hutcherson, meanwhile, rifled through a stack of documents, wearing an expression that suggested he was about to enjoy tearing Karoline's argument apart. He stepped back up. "Your Honor, Miss Leavitt conveniently glossed over the chain of custody for these emails. There's no proof that the whistleblower gave them directly to her clients. For all we know, they hacked into my client's servers." Karoline rose again, eyes locked on Hutcherson. "A baseless accusation. We have a statement from the whistleblower's attorney, confirming the authenticity of the documents. It's in the record." Hutcherson scoffed, flipping pages theatrically. "A statement from an unnamed source. Very convenient indeed." Karoline didn't miss a beat. "The whistleblower remains anonymous for their protection. If the court requests, we can have the whistleblower testify in camera, but that's a decision for a later stage." Judge Beckett frowned thoughtfully. "So far, both sides are posturing. Let's cut to the core. If these documents are real, the plaintiff's defamation claim is on thin ice. But if the documents were illegally obtained, your entire defense stands on shaky ground. We'll need something definitive to proceed." He glanced at the clock. "We'll take a brief recess. When we return, Miss Leavitt, you'll present the chain of custody. Mr. Hutcherson, you'll provide evidence these documents aren't valid or were obtained illegally." Gavel banged. Court stood adjourned for 15 minutes. Karoline felt the tension roll off her shoulders as she and Regina stepped out into the hallway. Journalists swarmed, eager for quotes. Cameras flashed. Reporters fired questions. Karoline only offered a curt, "No comment until the proceedings are done." She flashed a polite smile and retreated to a quiet corner with Regina. "You're doing great," Regina said softly. "He's rattled. You can see it." Karoline nodded. "He's throwing everything at us. We just have to keep showing the court that we've done our due diligence." Down the hallway, Hutcherson was surrounded by his own entourage, barking orders at junior associates and occasionally glancing over with a withering stare. Karoline pretended not to notice. After the break, they all filed back into the courtroom. Beckett wasted no time. "Miss Leavitt, let's see your chain of custody." Karoline handed over additional affidavits. These show the whistleblower's initial contact with the activist group's legal representation. Then there's a recorded date confirming when the documents were handed off. The data wasn't hacked. It was voluntarily surrendered. We have digital timestamps, IP logs, everything verifiable. The bailiff distributed copies to Hutcherson, who read them with a deepening scowl. "And, Your Honor," Karoline added, "these documents prove the emails were internal memos acknowledging elevated toxin levels. That directly supports the statements my clients made to the press." Hutcherson set down the affidavit. He walked to the podium, face impassive but eyes filled with calculated sharpness. "Your Honor, none of this negates the fact that Miss Leavitt's clients described the factory as on the brink of imminent disaster. The documents mention elevated levels, but nowhere does it state a meltdown hazard." Karoline's lips pressed into a firm line. She lifted another piece of paper. "These are reports from a separate investigation, one that compares the levels found in the plaintiff's factories to the threshold for hazardous waste. According to these guidelines, the plant was indeed at risk. The meltdown reference was a layman's term, but it reflects the seriousness, and that seriousness is real." Judge Beckett rubbed his temples, a telltale sign he was wrestling with the complexities. "All right," he said. "The motion to exclude the whistleblower documents is under consideration, but so far, Miss Leavitt has shown enough to proceed. I'm not ruling on their complete admissibility yet, but I won't throw them out at this stage. Next question, the alleged defamation." Hutcherson seized this opening. "Your Honor, the defamation goes beyond the documents. Miss Leavitt's clients used inflammatory language that implied my client's factories were practically nuclear disaster zones. This had a direct impact on the company's stock value. The law is clear. Even partial truths can be twisted into defamation if they cause undue harm." Karoline stepped forward. "We didn't claim nuclear meltdown. The phrase was meltdown hazard. In context, the meltdown referred to a catastrophic failure of waste containment. The data supports the notion that the factory's waste storage was dangerously high." She took a measured breath. "Also, the press release my clients issued didn't just rely on the whistleblower emails. It cited publicly available environmental data. If the plaintiff wants to claim defamation, they must show our statements were false. So far, they haven't refuted the data itself, just the language we used." Hutcherson advanced, voice rising with urgency. "Because language matters. If you scare the public, you're responsible for the consequences. This was a methodical attempt to drive down my client's share price while boosting the fame of Miss Leavitt's activist allies." Karoline folded her arms. That's an accusation without evidence. Show me how it was methodical or intended to manipulate the stock market. The evidence of toxicity is real and the public has a right to know. The gallery buzzed as watchers realized the intensity climbing between the two lawyers. Beckett rapped his gavel once. Let's not escalate. I'll take both arguments under advisement. Miss Leavitt, do you have any final remarks on the defamation claim? Karoline inclined her head. Just that we stand by the truth. My clients never aim to defame. They aim to inform. Hutcherson opened his mouth, but Beckett held up a hand, silencing him. I've heard enough for today. I'll issue a written opinion on the motion to exclude these emails. In the meantime, we'll set a date for full arguments on the defamation allegations. The judge pointed his gavel in Karoline's direction. Miss Leavitt, despite my initial doubts, you've shown surprising preparedness. But let me caution you, you're in my courtroom, not a debate club. Keep the theatrics out. A slight smile tugged at the corner of Karoline's mouth. Understood, Your Honor. Then the gavel dropped, concluding the day's session. Reporters in the gallery scrambled to file their stories, excited murmurs and clicking cameras flooding the air. The high-voltage showdown between Karoline and Hutcherson was front-page material. Karoline packed her papers quietly, aware that half a dozen cameras pointed her way. As she left the courtroom, a throng of journalists rushed to bombard her with questions. Are you confident the judge will rule in your favor? One shouted. Another pressed, is this just a publicity stunt? She paused, scanning the crowd for a moment. Then she chose her words carefully. I'm confident in the evidence. I'm confident in the law. That's all I'll say for now. Meanwhile, across the corridor, Hutcherson addressed his own cluster of microphones. We're going to prove these sensationalist claims had no merit, he declared, forcibly calm. Miss Leavitt may have had a few clever comebacks, but at the end of the day, facts and legal precedent will prevail. Karoline decided not to linger. She slipped away, offering no further sound bites, letting her quiet departure speak volumes about her confidence. But the moment she reached the street, a surge of adrenaline hit her. She leaned against a column and took a deep breath. Regina caught up, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. You did great, she said. I've never seen him so rattled. Karoline nodded. It's not over, she whispered. He'll come harder next time. They walked to a nearby cafe to debrief, away from the cameras. Karoline sipped hot tea while Regina flipped through pages of notes. We need to refine the angle on whistleblower protection. Hutcherson will try to poke holes. Karoline set her cup down. I'll dig deeper. If they want to dispute the authenticity, we'll strengthen the chain of custody. If they claim we twisted the facts, we'll bring in more experts. Regina grinned. That's the spirit. The next day, word spread like wildfire about Karoline's performance. Newspapers ran headlines. Young attorney stands her ground. Leavitt surprises veteran lawyer. Across social media, commentators speculated whether she'd keep up the momentum or crumble under the next wave of attacks. Karoline herself remained laser-focused. She wasn't in this for vanity. She needed to protect her clients from a ruinous lawsuit and expose what she believed was an environmental hazard. Meanwhile, Hutcherson strategized. He pored over the plaintiff's documents, searching for weaknesses. He called in experts willing to challenge the environmental data. He scouted any personal or professional missteps in Karoline's past that might undermine her credibility. His approach was relentless. Weeks passed before the next hearing. By then, tension had climbed to a near fever pitch. The case was no longer just a local legal dispute. It was national news, drawing commentary from political pundits and environmental activists alike. The morning of the hearing, the courthouse was packed to capacity. People lined the halls, security ushers controlling the overflow crowd. Photographers jostled for position, snapping pictures of Karoline as she entered in a crisp black suit. When the hearing started, Judge Beckett announced he'd reviewed the chain of custody documents. I see no immediate evidence of theft. The whistleblower's statement appears credible. Therefore, the motion to exclude the emails is denied. The gallery erupted in hushed excitement. Karoline maintained her composure, though relief flickered across her eyes. Hutcherson's mouth twitched in frustration. Now came the deeper dive into the alleged defamation. Hutcherson presented testimony from financial experts, trying to prove the activist's statements caused a direct plummet in the plaintiff's stock value. He displayed graphs, data sets, trending lines that coincided with the release of the toxic meltdown hazard statement. Here is tangible proof, he proclaimed. The day Miss Leavitt's clients went public, the stock nosedived. Karoline rose to cross-examine. Isn't it true, she asked the financial expert, that the market was already reacting to rumors of poor safety protocols before my client's press release. There were local news segments about the factory's waste management issues. The stock was already trending down. The expert shifted uncomfortably. There were minor concerns, but the major drop came after the meltdown claim. Karoline nodded. But you can't definitively say the meltdown claim alone caused the drop. There were multiple factors at play: regulatory fines, local protests, other negative press. Hutcherson objected. Speculative, Your Honor. Beckett allowed Karoline to continue. I'm simply establishing that correlation doesn't prove causation. Next, Hutcherson brought forward a toxicologist who insisted the factory's emission levels, while above average, weren't catastrophic. They weren't safe, she admitted, but not to the degree the defendants described. Hutcherson hammered the point. Not meltdown level, correct? She agreed. Not meltdown level. Karoline stepped up for cross-examination. Yet you'd confirm that the levels were, in your words, a major cause for concern? Yes, the toxicologist said. Karoline seized the momentum. So you'd agree the factory's conditions pose significant risks if left unaddressed? Yes, potentially, the toxicologist conceded. Karoline returned to her seat. She didn't need the expert to say meltdown. She needed the court to see that serious hazards existed, which justified her client's strong wording. Both sides continued trading pointed arguments. Hutcherson tried painting Karoline's clients as alarmists hungry for attention. Karoline retorted that the plaintiff's company had a history of ignoring safety violations. The tension in the courtroom built with each exchange of evidence, each stern look from Judge Beckett. As the hearing neared conclusion, Karoline called her final witness, an environmental engineer who had visited the plant. He testified in detail about corroding tanks, insufficient containment measures, and the potential for a large-scale chemical spill. While I can't say meltdown in a nuclear sense, he said, the structural integrity is so poor that any catastrophic failure could release toxic substances into the nearby community, effectively a meltdown scenario. Hutcherson paced, eyes flashing with annoyance. He cross-examined fiercely, trying to discredit the engineer's methodology. But the man remained resolute, pointing to photos and calculations. The more he explained, the clearer it became that the risk was real. Finally, Beckett asked the gallery for silence and stared down at Karoline. You're asserting that your client simply gave the public accurate information, albeit in strong language. Karoline nodded. Yes, Your Honor. They reported the facts as they understood them, bolstered by credible sources. The intention wasn't to defame, it was to warn. Hutcherson frowned. They defamed, period. Beckett rubbed his forehead, turning off his microphone for a moment to confer with his clerk. The clerk nodded, scribbling notes. When Beckett flicked the microphone back on, his face was grave. We'll adjourn and reconvene tomorrow for closing arguments. Be advised, I'll be scrutinizing every piece of data. Court is adjourned. Gavel dropped. Journalists scrambled out of the room, eager to broadcast updates. Karoline let out a breath. She felt confident but understood a final ruling could swing unpredictably. Hutcherson marched past with a tight-lipped glare, clearly seething. That evening, Karoline worked late at Regina's office, refining their closing argument. They pored over statutes, case precedents, and the raw data from the factory. We have to tie it all together, Karoline said, leaning back in her chair. Show the judge that the language was harsh for a reason, because the hazard is that bad. Regina nodded. And we also have to remind him that defamation law protects honest statements of concern. If it's true, it's not defamatory. The next morning, Karoline stood at the podium with unwavering resolve. Her voice was measured, but each word carried conviction. Your Honor, the purpose of defamation law is to protect individuals from unfounded attacks. However, if what's stated is substantially true, it can't be defamation. When my clients labeled the situation a meltdown hazard, they conveyed the severity of the risk. Multiple experts testified to structural failings that could trigger a chemical catastrophe. The plaintiff never refuted these failings. They simply argued over semantics. She continued, in a world where corporations sometimes bury inconvenient truths, whistleblowers become our watchdogs. My clients' motivations were not malicious. They used strong language precisely because the public deserved a strong warning. And if the plaintiff's stock dipped, that's a byproduct of transparency, not a targeted scheme. Hutcherson's closing argument took the opposite tack. They sensationalized. They profited off panic. The meltdown term was an attention-grabbing exaggeration that harmed the company's reputation and finances. Even if some issues existed, they were nowhere near meltdown levels. My client was defamed, plain and simple. With the final word spoken, Beckett deliberated. Tension mounted as he whispered with his clerk, scanning pages of notes. At last, he faced the court. "I'll issue a final decision in writing within a week. For now, the record is closed." Gavel struck. The crowd erupted into a frenzy of questions directed at Karoline, at Hutcherson, at anyone who might give them a snippet of insight. Karoline packed her files, ignoring the cacophony. Only when she emerged onto the steps outside did she make a brief statement to the press. "We trust in the rule of law, and we believe truth will prevail." She could almost taste the electric charge in the air. Fear, hope, curiosity. Everyone wanted to see if the young lawyer had managed to outmaneuver a seasoned legal pro. But for Karoline, it wasn't about winning or losing. It was about protecting her clients and ensuring the public understood a genuine hazard. If the verdict went against them, she'd appeal. If it went in their favor, she'd take it as validation, but remain vigilant. The verdict day arrived, and the courtroom was at capacity. Judge Beckett read from a prepared statement. He methodically recounted the evidence, acknowledging the authenticity of the emails, the expert testimonies, and the contested language. Then he declared that while the term meltdown hazard was alarmist, the broader statements about the factory's condition were substantially accurate. Therefore, this court does not find defamation in the defendant's choice of words, he concluded, emphasizing that free speech includes the right to express concerns on matters of public health, particularly when supported by evidence. In short, Karoline's clients were absolved of defamation liability. The hush that fell over the courtroom was heavier than any outburst could be. Then a flurry of chatter and camera flashes broke the stillness. Karoline glanced at Hutcherson, who stood stone-faced, lips pressed into a thin line. She almost pitied him, almost. Outside, a surge of reporters greeted her. But before addressing them, Karoline paused, soaking in the enormity of the moment. She felt the warmth of Regina's hand on her shoulder. She heard the distant hum of traffic, the click of cameras. And deep inside, she knew this wasn't just a personal victory. It was a statement. The truth, when properly defended, still mattered more than corporate power or slick public relations. She approached the podium set up on the courthouse steps. Journalists thrust microphones toward her. Karoline cleared her throat. "We're grateful the court recognized that sometimes strong language is necessary when lives and health are at stake. This wasn't about sensationalism. It was about alerting the public to real dangers. My clients are relieved, and we hope this outcome sends a message to anyone who tries to silence whistleblowers." Regina gave Karoline a proud nod. The crowd pressed in, demanding more details, but Karoline merely repeated that the written judgment spoke for itself. Hutcherson, trying to exit discreetly, was intercepted by a wave of cameras. He gave a terse, "We're considering our options," before vanishing into a waiting car. Karoline turned to see her clients, ordinary citizens who had stood up for their community, wipe away tears of relief. She walked over, embraced them, and whispered, "You stood for something important. Never forget that." Then, in that swirl of people and flashing lights, Karoline took a deep, grounding breath. This was just the beginning of her journey. But she had proved that she wasn't merely a young upstart or an empty figurehead. She was someone willing to fight tooth and nail for what she believed was right. And in doing so, she reminded everyone watching, never underestimate a person who comes prepared, who knows her facts, and who stands resolute in the face of condescension. The courthouse lobby buzzed with a chaotic energy, swirling with reporters packing up gear and anxious onlookers discussing the surprise outcome. Karoline slipped through the main doors, feeling the crisp Los Angeles air wash over her. Cameras pivoted in her direction, but she wove gently away, politely declining further questions. Soon, she was on the crowded sidewalk, where traffic horns fought for dominance with the hum of curious murmurs. A voice called her name. She turned to find Judge Ronald Beckett exiting behind her, escorting a clerk. Their eyes met momentarily, and in that instant, something unspoken passed between them. Respect, perhaps. He gave her a measured nod, then continued down the steps, disappearing into a waiting vehicle. Karoline let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. A swirl of residual tension started to loosen in her chest. Regina caught up, her heels clicking against concrete. "We did it," she said, voice trembling with palpable relief. Karoline managed a small smile. "Yeah," she murmured. "We did." High above, the sun dipped behind the towers, painting the sky with shades of gold and deep purple. Pedestrians brushed past, glued to phones and daily concerns. Karoline stood still for a moment, reflecting on how many had assumed she'd buckle under pressure. Yet here she was, on the other side of a legal showdown that showcased truth over bluster. "Caroline," a client called, rushing over to express gratitude one last time. They hugged her without hesitation, tears shining. She gently patted their back, whispering, "Stay safe, stay strong." Then she stepped away, leaving them to celebrate with their loved ones. A wave of quiet pride flooded her, but it came without arrogance, just the surety that knowledge, grit, and integrity could still tip the scales toward justice. She inhaled deeply, exhaled slowly, and headed down the busy sidewalk, certain that new battles would arise, and just as certain she'd be ready.